In the world of music and entertainment, we oftentimes focus on the musician without realizing that there's an entire group of people that go into the creative process of making an album. And in this series, what we focus on is not so much as the musician, but the graphic designer, the painter, and the photographer, the people who create the album covers of musicians that you know and love. My name is Pope Stefanos, and this is the Artist Album Cover Podcast. And in today's episode, we're talking about Virginia's own Pusha T. Following the release of the Clipse's third studio album, Till the Casket Drops, the duo would announce that they'd be going on a hiatus in 2010. Now, this would come on the heels of several different issues that the Clipse had going on, particularly with Pusha T's older brother, Malice, basically taking a step back from the type of drug-fueled raps that they were talking about. Malice would go on to change his name to No Malice and would go on to make more music that's more Christian-based, more secular-based, if you will. This would leave Pusha T in this very particular and peculiar space because he still wanted to make the same type of music that he was making with his brother, but he had to do it now on his own. This would cause Pusha T to go on to sign to Kanye West's Good Music label and Def Jam in 2011, where he would release the Fear of God mixtape and the Fear of God 2 EP. Now, it would take 2 more years before Pusha T would release his debut studio album, My Name Is My Name, October 7th, 2013, under Good Music Def Jam Records. Now, there are 2 versions of this album cover. The album cover was done by Jesse Conda with the art direction done by Justin Saunders. The artwork photo was done by Christian Yanks and Ty Lindsay, with the photography being done by Fabian Montique. The creative director was Virgil Abloh, rest in peace, Matthew Williams, Joe Perez as well. Now, the singles of this album include Pain, Numbers on the Board, Sweet Serenade, and honestly my personal favorite, Nostalgia. Now, this album cover would be Pusha T's debut studio album, and because of that, Kanye was very heavily involved in this debut studio album. Pusha was kind of basically one of Kanye's first signees to the label, and so Donda was the hired for the marketing team for this album cover. A lot of this album cover, in all honesty, has minimalism involved in it. Just as we're talking to Capricorn Clark from a Fader magazine, who had a discussion where he said that he did a lot of research on Big Daddy Kane, just to use as a reference for this album cover. Now, Pusha T is the one who came up with the album title name, with Clark and Pusha coming over with the cover proposal of this. They wanted that old school Kane type of imagery, that type of imagery that you would see in the 1960s during protests, during those types of photographies. Now, the album cover was done very, very smartly, just because when we look at this, the barcode is actually just, when you think of it, when you scan it, when you go to the store, you scan it, it's no different than the barcode that's done on when you're actually purchasing it. So this is a little bit of trolling from Pusha T, in all honesty. This is a little bit of just a joke between the customer and the seller, just because when you look at this album cover, the idea behind it, right, and the idea for Pusha T is somebody who's selling a product, right, and he oftentimes refers to his music as a certain type of product that is sold within the streets, which is also very similar to the background of this album cover. So he's likening us as music listeners to this audio dope, if you will, to the customers, the same type of people who would go out to the streets to buy that same type of white, that same type of powder. So it's a little bit of a troll in that, in what he's saying and how he's delivering that message to us as a customer, as a consumer of his music. Now, the other version of this album cover features Pusha T in this all black, looking up at the sky, almost in this type of way as if he's looking for redemption, right? Because the idea is that the background is white and he's covered in all black, and it's this very Vanta black type of look that he has going on. And it's almost as if he's looking up for deliverance, right? When you think of looking up to the sky and the backgrounds in this clear sky, A lot of times in Pusha T's messages, he's talking about deliverance. He's talking about trying to be saved from the life that he's chosen, the path that he's chosen, despite the fact that he still gains benefits from it. He knows that it is not right, that what he's doing. And so when I look at this album cover, I think it's done very smartly as somebody who's trying to sell a product to a customer and is doing it in this very cheeky way, if you will. In all honesty, between these two album covers, I enjoy the both of them. I like the delivery of them both, and you haven't really seen anybody do a barcode type of album cover in this way, just because of how it's given to us. Now, the interesting thing about the numbers at the bottom, I tried doing my research on them. They're in no particular way. They have no particular meaning. I tried finding out what they would mean. They're not done in any type of specific order. And so, despite the fact that that's there, I still like that it's done in that way. Now, the deluxe album cover is still my favorite just because it has that darkness feel to it. It has that look of redemption to it. It has that look of like raw, just eeriness to it. A lot of times Pusha T would deliver himself as almost this eerie villain, and so this is like a great introduction to us for him as a solo rapper. King Push, Darkest Before Dawn, The Prelude, would be Pusha T's sophomore studio album, being released December 18th, 2015 under Good Music and Def Jam Records, with singles that include Untouchable, MFTR, and Crutches, Crosses, and Caskets. Try saying that 3 times. Now, the art direction was done by Justin Saunders, Joe Perez, and Nate Brown, with the art coordinator being Ty Lindsay. The creative director was Virgil Abloh and Kanye West, with Joe Perez being in charge of graphic design. The photography was done by Fabian Montig. Now, just like Pusha T's previous album, My Name Is My Name, Donda creators were heavily involved in the creation of this album cover, with Fabian Montig saying that we researched scarification portraits of African tribes, the magnitude of that pain captured in a moment. Now, let's focus a little bit and hone in a little bit more on this idea of African scarification and what it symbolizes, and then we can look at what it symbolizes and how we can take that to apply to Pusha T's album cover. Now, when it comes to the history of African scarification, in different tribes and in different cultures, and of course in different histories, it has different meanings. Now, one of the ways that it's used is in a rite of passage, a transition from adolescence to adulthood. So when an African boy or an African girl reaches a certain age, they will get scarred, or they will have scarification done on their body, just to symbolize that this child, this person, is no longer a baby. Now they are a young boy. And then they will go from being a young boy or girl to being a young male or female, young adult. And then they'll go into a full adult where they're accepted from their tribe and their society. So scarification can symbolize different things dependent upon the age in that age group. It basically symbolizes where that person's status is. But there's a pain in that because you have to earn that. You actually have to live and go through experiences in life in order to earn that right to get those scars. Now, another way in which African scarification is applied is a way to deter traitors. Now, this goes back to ancient practices, usually done around the 10th century from African cultures, in which a lot of African cultures would use scarification as a way to deter slave traders from trying to capture them, because they would see these types of people as basically damaged goods. This was particular for a lot of countries who are of Islamic in origin, where scarification and body modification was heavily frowned upon. So from around the 10th century, so from around 1100s all the way up until I'd say about the 1600s, this was a time period where scarification was heavily practiced, but used in a way to deter other basically traders from trying to capture them. Now, when we look at it in this type of way, we can see that Pusha T is trying to basically deter people from going and trying to purchase him, trying to basically say, hey, I'm not for sale. I am not somebody that you can just purchase like that. And so when we look at it also in a way of where it's a transition from youth to adolescence, we can see that these are these types of scars that Pusha T's had to earn throughout his career and also throughout his entire life. And so when we're looking at these scarifications and we're thinking of it in this type of way, we can also see that there's this pain that comes with it as well. So when we look at this album cover, we see that Pusha T has his back and his face turned to the camera, away from the camera, while there's a dove flying down and descending upon his back. And so we can see it, and it can be symbolized as Pusha T basically turning his back on innocence, turning his back on the pure, basically those that he's caused pain to, those that he's caused harm to, through more so the product that he's delivered in the past. And we can also see the dove being a symbolization for that same product, but we can also see the dove being a symbolization of peace, purity, tranquility, all of those types of things. And so there was a magazine that was also released with this, a zine, if you will, that was released with it, where there was a lot of black and gray motif. There was a lot of religion that was tied into it. There was a lot of these types of motifs and the symbolization that went into saying, all right, this is an album cover that shows the darkness, that shows the type of hopelessness that one can experience in these moments, right? The darkest before dawn means that there's always going to be a light at the end of this. And so we can also see it as Pusha T, in a sense, turning his back towards this light, saying as a way of saying, hey, this light is not where I want to be. I would prefer to be in the shadows. I would prefer to be in this place to where I don't have to face the innocence and the harm of those that I've inflicted upon people and those around me. Because we can also look at this dove and we can see that this dove, rather than ascending, it's descending. And so Pusha T does not want to see the descent of innocence, the descent of purity. He'd rather have his back faced and face towards this darkness because it's more comforting, it's more familiar to him, and he'd rather deal with those scars and bear them on his own. And so there's a lot of symbolization that goes into this album cover just when you think of the background of Pusha T coming up. Pusha T's third studio album, Daytona, would be released May 25th, 2018 under Good Music and Def Jam, with the single What Would Meek Do? Now, this album was supposed to be the sequel to and the follow-up to his previous album, King Push, The Darkest Before Dawn, The Prelude. Now, this album title would be scrapped by Kanye West, oddly enough. Now, Kanye would play a significant role again in this album cover and the creation of the album art, and in a very, very interesting way, some would argue. Now, the album for Pusha T, the album title Daytona, represents the fact that I have the luxury of time, the luxury that only comes when you have a skill set that you're confident in. That would be what Pusha T would say in regards to the album title. And I love the fact that he gives it this type of title and its name, just because when you think of Daytona, when you think of the idea of Daytona Beach, when you think of Daytona 500, there's this idea of going there and relaxing, of just sitting back, not having a care in the world, not having a single worry in the world. When you go to the Daytona, when you go to those races, it's a full day thing. You're not doing anything else but sitting back, drinking some beers. Same thing applies to Daytona Beach. The idea of not having to worry about anything in life and the luxury that comes with it. But interestingly enough, there is a little bit of a downside that comes to this luxury that Pusha T would call into in this album cover. Now, let's go and focus on the album cover, because we talked about how Kanye West plays a significant role in this. Now, this album cover was done by Akeem Smith. Now, the album cover, the original cover, was scrapped by Kanye West. Now, there are two different versions of this kind of floating around, but the album cover that's come out was a photo of Whitney Houston's bathroom in 2006. Now, this is a bathroom that's shown to have a lot of drug imagery, a lot of paraphernalia that's in the background. Now, this is during the time when Whitney Houston was going through this basically binge of different types of paraphernalia. The photo would be released in 2012 by the National Enquirer, a tabloid magazine. Kanye West would pay $85,000 to license it and change the album cover at the last minute, 2 days before the release. Now, here's the entire thing about this album cover and its backlash. Bobby Brown, the partner and husband to Whitney Houston, would go on to announce that this album cover was distasteful. He didn't like it. He actually really hated it, just because he himself was constantly and partially considered blamed for the passing of Whitney and her introduction to these types of basically paraphernalia. Now, the Whitney Houston estate would also release a statement saying that they found this album cover very, very distasteful. Now, for the sake of artistry, for the sake of creativity, this is one of those times when you can see that the musician, the person who's creating the music, and the person who is in charge of the album cover, in this case it would be Kanye West. I wouldn't say that there's this kind of clash, but Pusha T would call on and say that Kanye would just change it at the last minute, and how that kind of shocked him and surprised him. And there was a little bit of a worry in the fact that this album would have to be pushed back, or people would have the same reception to it. But in all honesty, I think that this kind of plays into the idea of Daytona. Now, as we look at this album cover, we can go into the history of Whitney Houston and the idea of the luxury that comes with Daytona, a lifestyle of luxury. Usually when you think of Pusha T and his raps, there's also this tie of drug raps, of coke raps, if you will, in it. And so when you think of Daytona Beach, when you think of Florida, you think of these drug-fueled parties, and what is everybody doing? Snow, right? And so when we think of this album cover and we look at the person who it's closely tied to and how certain medications that she had, there is this kind of access to luxury that comes with it. You're not able to readily have this all the time if you're just a regular person, right? But if you're somebody who has that luxury of saying, hey, well, you know what? I got a guy who can get it for me right now, right? And that kind of can play into the downfall for that type of lifestyle. And you can see that in this album cover, right? Where you see all of these types of drugs and you see the consequences of that in that person's life. And so with Pusha T going into it and using this as an album cover, I think that this was more so a Kanye West thing. This is more of a Kanye than a Pusha T in terms of using this as an album cover. Just because the other thing that interests me as well is who's the person who took the photo, because it was published by a tabloid magazine, but it had to have been somebody in Whitney's estate who took the photo to give it to this tabloid and this magazine company. And so there's this idea of when you're living this lifestyle too, you don't know who's around, you don't know who's close to you, you don't know who your friends really are, because the moment something happens to you, they're going to be so quick to run to the tabloids, they're going to be so quick to run to the magazines, they're going to be so quick to tell everyone every single thing in detail about you, and they will be so quick to release any little personal information that they have about you. And so there is this downside to the Daytona lifestyle. There is this dark side to it as well, and Pusha T oftentimes raps about that in his music. You don't only just see the bright side of it, you don't see the glitz and glamour, you also see the effects that it has on people's life. Yeah, having access to these types of drugs is great, and you're living with around people and you're all enjoying this high off of life, both metaphorically and physically, but then what happens when you come down from it? Now, if you're approaching this album cover as someone who doesn't know the history of Whitney Houston or her music or her legacy, and you're coming into this just as a Pusha T fan, and you just see this album cover, or if you're just seeing the album cover and you're seeing it and approaching it from the idea of it being in a gallery or something that you see as a poster, then we can look at this album cover in a different type of way and in a different type of light, just because as we're looking at it and we're seeing it, we can tell that it is a photo of a bathroom. But the idea of this bathroom being disheveled, this bathroom being disorganized, this bathroom being messy, and it kind of contradicts the idea of Daytona and the Daytona lifestyle, just because in your mind you would think that the Daytona life is just beauty, right? It's kind of one of these things of just the glitz and glamour, again going into this idea of Miami beach nights, right? This wonderful lifestyle, right? The parties, you know, the girls, the women, the fancy cars, right? But there's also this irony in it, right? And the longer you look at this photo and you see the different types of paraphernalia and you see the different types of items that are scattered about, you kind of can come back to what I'm getting at in this idea of, okay, Daytona is not just a lifestyle of this luxury, but it's also this lifestyle where it brings you back to this kind of, I guess you can say, darkness, if you will, this type of downside to the lifestyle where, yeah, you have access to these types of drugs, but nobody talks about the ODs that happen. Pusha's fourth studio album, It's Almost Dry, will be released April 22nd, 2022 under Def Jam and Good Music Records. Now, this would be Pusha's final album under the former, having parted ways with Kanye West. Now, singles from this album include Diet Coke, Hear Me Clearly, Neck and Wrist, and Scrape It Off. Now, this album was also solely produced by both Kanye West and Pharrell Williams, who is a childhood friend of Pusha T. Now, this would be Pusha T's first album to reach #1 on the Billboard 200. This would be Pusha T's first album to ever reach these heights. The art direction, again, was done by Kanye West. And as we've said before, Kanye has been very heavily involved in the process and the creation of a lot of Pusha's album covers. That's not to say that he himself isn't involved in it. Pusha did make several statements where he says that he does leave these types of things to Kanye's marketing team, which they've done an amazing job over the course of Pusha's career in pushing his album covers. And I think because of that, Pusha's album covers oftentimes give this unorthodox look, this unorthodox feel to them, where you really have to think about the double meaning that goes into that. And there's no different with this album cover, with the cover design being done by Sterling Ruby. Now, Sterling Ruby himself is an American-Dutch artist based in LA who works on various mixed mediums, from sculptures to ceramics to paintings to photography and to collages. So when we're looking at this album cover, let's focusing heavily on that collage part. We can see that this album cover does have that kind of collage type of feel to it. And in all honesty, the one thing that I immediately come into mind with the album title, It's Almost Dry, is this idea of a mixtape. And when I think of a mixtape, there are two different ways that this can be taken. And we can take it more so from the version of it being It's Almost Dry. Now, there is a double meaning to this album that Pusha would describe to us, saying that in terms of a painting, you end up having to tell people while they're waiting on it, it's almost dry. Just like, hey, when's this painting gonna be finished? You've been working on it for a long time. Hey, it's almost dry. You just gotta be a little bit patient with me. I still got some details I gotta work out. There's still some things that I have to fix on it. Now, Pusha would relate that to the drug culture, where he would say in that culture, a lot of times you'll have people waiting on a product and it's not dry yet. We oftentimes know Pusha T is known for rapping about a certain type of substance that you oftentimes have to cook up, and before you can serve it to people, it does have to be fully dried. And so this idea of, hey, just wait on it, just calm down, it's almost there, it's almost dry, it represents also this idea of luxury, going back to this idea for Pusha that for him, the idea of his music is that he has the luxury of time. But for me, I feel as if Pusha has this almost King the Conqueror-esque type of like energy to him, just because he is somebody who isn't worried about the passing of time. He knows that time is on his side and he can always use it to his advantage, because people are going to be waiting ages. People are going to be waiting a long time just for Pusha to drop. And so when we're looking at this album cover very much goes into that feeling, just because it gives you that mixtape look with it, with the words saying it's almost dry at the bottom, but you have this collage type of look to it, just like in a mixtape where it's a mosh podge, a combination, a mixture, an amalgamation of several different types of mediums, of several different types of colors, different types of formats, different types of textures to it as well. And then once it's finally dry, you can step back and look at the final piece of what the project is. And so I really like when you look at album covers like this and see that meaning into it and say, well, what's the artist trying to go for in this? And so I think this is a great album cover representation where Pusha T is working with a painter, and they're both coming up with this idea of, hey, we're working on a product, we're working on a piece, and it's almost dry. Those of you who've worked with oil paintings know exactly what I'm talking about. Oil paintings take forever to dry, like forever. And so oftentimes you work on it bit by bit, piece by piece, and there's a lot of patience in that. Pusha himself, I believe, is a Taurus. So it's this idea of, hey, patience, work on your craft, work on your skill, and then you get better with time. That patience that you have in working on your skill is what's going to get you better at it. And so when I think of this album cover, I think of it in all of those different types of ways. And in all honesty, for an album cover that is split between two super producers, I think that it's done really well. It's easy to look at Pusha T's lyrics and the content of it and label it as any other drug rapper. But when we really look at Pusha's history, when we look at what he's gone through, not only in the rap game, but also outside of the rap game, and everything that he's had to deal with his managers and the people that he grew up with, and seeing the pain that he inflicted upon some of the people around him by distributing the products that he sold, we can see that Pusha raps from this place of pain. He also raps from this place of regret. Yes, there is the luxury that he has that comes from what he sells, but he also likens it to the products that he sold in the past and the pain that it brought to people. And so it's something that still ties him back to the music. It comes full circle in that sense. And so when we're looking at each of his album covers, we can see that there's this tie to the streets, to the music, in different ways, in different forms, in different fashions. Whether we're looking at an album cover such as My Name Is My Name, where he's comparing us, the consumer, to those who would buy the consumed product on the street, to an album cover such as It's Almost Dry, where he's discussing that same type of product, right? Then we look at album covers such as Daytona, where he's talking about the luxury, but in that luxury, we look at an album cover like King Push, where there's that darkness that comes from it. Pusha turning his back on the innocence that he's inflicted on these people, the pain that he's inflicted on these people. There's a downside to this lifestyle. Although there is this luxury, although there is this greatness, we also have to be reminded of the fact that it all comes with a price. And Pusha himself is constantly reminding us through his music and his lyrics that, yeah, although that there's a good side to this, there's also a downside to this as well. Thank you all for taking the time out to listen to this episode. Pusha T is one of my favorite rappers, and in all honesty, I think he's one of those rappers that defines a generation and has also influenced a generation. Like I said, grinding is timeless. That beat is timeless, and so when you think of rappers whose names will go down in history, Pusha is one of them, just because the man's been consistently dropping classics and he's been consistently dropping music for the past 2 decades. And in all honesty, it takes a certain type of skill, a certain type of craft to be able to rap about a certain subject or a certain topic and give it to the fan base over 2 decades and it still be fresh. I mean, there's not a single person who's gonna say, oh man, Pusha fell off. If he dropped a project right now, people would run to listen to it. And in all honesty, I'm looking forward to his next project where he reunites back with his brother Malice, the Clipse, for their next album. And so with that, guys, let me know what you think about each one of Pusha T's album covers down in the comments, and I'll catch you guys on the next one. Thank you.